Hi, this is justincolletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, I'm going to reveal the 7 deadly sins of mixing. This one could also have the alternate title of The Mastering Engineer's Pet Peeves, because this one comes in response to a listener question about what are the things that annoy mastering engineers when they hear them in mixes. So I'm going to give this to you from the perspective of a mastering engineer. These are the 7 things where if you do them, it's going to make it more likely that you're going to be unhappy with the results you get back from mastering, and a mastering engineer who's really in your corner might suggest some mix tweaks. Here's the question that I got that I'm answering this week for more context. A fellow with the handle of Luchu Train writes in, "Hey Justin, what do you think are some of the top pet peeves that mastering engineers experience when getting a mix? What could we do as producers to make their lives easier when they get projects? Thanks." It's a great question. And my list is going to be maybe a little bit different than the average mastering engineer's list. What I expect the average mastering engineer might write is, here's a loudness target that you should shoot for, and here are specific numbers. Or I think that's what a lot of mixers are looking for. But I don't think that's the kind of advice and the kind of pet peeves that most mastering engineers who I really respect are going to throw back at you. And they're not going to be the kind of thing I'm going to recommend either. Now, I'll let you know, I did an episode not too long ago called the Top 10 Reasons Your Mix Sucks. And there's going to be a tiny bit of overlap with that list, but actually this list is pretty separate from that list because it's not necessarily about mixes that suck. It's about mixes that get to the final stage of mastering and you realize, there's this 1 or 2 things where if we just tweak those, everything will turn out a little bit better. And I think we're going to have to go back for a mix revision. So I'm going to give them to you right now, these 7 deadly sins. If you can avoid these, your mixes are going to sound better. Your mastering sessions are going to go a lot smoother and you'll be much happier with the final results that you get. So let's get into it. The only thing I have to do before we get deep into it is give the quickest of shout outs to our sponsors on this podcast. And the most important sponsor on this podcast is, as always, you. The best way you can sponsor this podcast, well, give us a like if you're on YouTube. Give us a subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, consider giving us a rating and review. It really does help. The best thing you can do to sponsor this podcast is sponsor yourself. Check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs that will teach you to mix faster, better, with more creativity and more confidence than ever before. Or check out our full-length course, Mastering Demystified. If you want to get into mastering for yourself, I'll teach you everything that I know about mastering over at masteringendemystified.com. Both of those come with a 30-day money-back guarantee. You know what else comes with the 30-day money-back guarantee? My love for you. No, also, that does, but Compression Breakthroughs, the full-length course on compression, check it out at compressionbreakthroughs.com, where you will learn to finally hear compression, understand compression, and even more importantly, use compression at a professional level on literally every type of instrument in every context. Check it out at compressionbreakthroughs.com. Probably one of the most useful things I've ever done in my entire life. Before we get into these 7 deadly sins of mixing, I just want to hip you to some free stuff. Check out GPU Audio. They are giving away a free convolution reverb plugin over at gpu.audio/sonicscoop. That's gpu.audio/sonicscoop, where you can get limited time free early access to their new convolution reverb plugin powered by the GPU inside your computer. Want some more stuff? Check out for free for 30 days some of my favorite plugins ever made from SoundToys. Go over to soundtoys.com. They've been sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. They make some of the most fun to use plugins out there, and you can try out anything they make for free for 30 days. They're at soundtoys.com. All right, let's get right into it. Before I get into the 7 deadly sins of mixing, I want to give you the answer that most mastering engineers will probably give you, and that is, your mix is too loud, your mix is too hyped up, you are squashing your mix, there's too much compression, too much limiting on it. You're trying to master your own mix, and now I've got no room to work with. That's the kind of thing you're probably expecting to hear, right? Like, oh, you did this thing super loud, and now I don't have any room to work with. You know, I don't really care too much about that. I get projects from some mixing clients and from artists that come in super hot. They're at a level where they practically sound mastered already. And I just make them sound slightly better than that, or don't mess them up. Or in some cases, if they really are pushing things too hard to where it just doesn't sound good, yeah, maybe we do have to go back a tick to the mixing stage and say, hey, can you back off on some of the bus compression and bus limiting a little bit? It's just a little bit too squashed, and it's more squashed than is appropriate for the style. But I gotta tell you, it's actually pretty rare that that happens. I find that most of the time when people send me pretty hot mixes, it's because they're pretty confident mixing pretty hot. And it's my job to be just like a little extra QC on it and make it sound a little bit better, or make all the different mixes they've done fit together on one album. And it is, I think, the exception rather than the norm with the hot mixes that I get in, that they really need to go back a tick. Some mastering engineers really don't like this because there's no room left to impress or wow the client, who is already super loud and hyped up sounding and practically sounds like a finished mastered record. The mastering engineer doesn't get to go, see how much louder and more impressive I made your mix sound. I'm a great mastering engineer. Because they, in many cases, just have to end up sending back something that sounds kind of like the mix, maybe slightly better, maybe with the low end just dialed in a hair more, maybe with the high end pushed a hair more, or tucked back a hair more, but they're making fairly minor changes. And that bugs a lot of them because they don't get to impress you and dazzle you. Me, I don't really care. I know that I'm going to get paid whether I have to do 20 dB of cumulative EQ or 0.2 dB of cumulative EQ. My rate's the same either way. And you're better off going with someone more expensive who does less than someone who's less expensive who wants to dazzle you and does more when they shouldn't. And I think that's a part of doing good mastering, is knowing when to dig in hard and push things hard, and knowing when to lay off and not push things too hard. So I don't have real big targets for mastering levels. I want to get that out of the way, even though a lot of mastering engineers might give you that advice. I just have one rule, which is don't put a bunch of limiting and compression on your mix bus just because you want to get it loud. You should be doing any compression or limiting, if you want to, on your mix bus because you think it makes the mix sound better. And that should be your guide at the mixing stage for whether you're doing that stuff to the mix bus. So if it's just for loudness that you're putting on, like at the end, after you've mixed it, you've thrown on some limiting so that you can be loud enough for reference next to commercial stuff, take that off. But if it's stuff that you actually mixed through and is part of your mix, you got to leave that stuff on. It informed every choice you made up until that point if you put it on early in the process. So that's my thing there. Let's get that out of the way. Now I'll get into my actual 7 that I really care about and that I find that more often need to get a mix sent back for some subtle revisions. So number 1, I touched on in a recent episode, so I'll just talk about it really quickly, and that is giving the mastering engineer references that aren't really your sonic references, they're your spiritual references. I just did an episode very recently where I talked about this. I think it's called How to Avoid the Number 1 Mastering Mistake. And this was that number 1 mastering mistake. Giving the mastering engineer, when they say, hey, are there any records you really love the sound of, which is something I like to ask my clients, giving them the names of bands and albums that you love, but they're like 30 or 40 years old and you don't actually want to sound like those records. So then the mastering engineer listens to those records, and like if they make it sound like those records and give it back to you, you're like, that's not actually what I wanted to sound like. There's all of these other more modern references that I didn't want to tell you about because I'm embarrassed that I listened to them, that I'm actually going to compare my record next to, and can you make it sound like those? Just tell them about those in the beginning, the records you're actually going to listen to yours next to. So that's number 1. We talked about in another podcast episode, so I'm not going to give you the full spiel about it, but I hope you get the idea. I'll link to that episode here in case you want to check it out. But the next one, and this is probably the second biggest mix mistake that will mess up your mastering session, is making major balance mistakes, like messing up the mixing part of mixing. And you'd be amazed at how often this happens, that you have an issue where the vocals are just way too quiet for the style or genre, or sometimes the vocals are just too loud for the style or genre, Or my proverbial favorite example, the hi-hat that's louder than the guitar solo, which I've experienced far too many times. And these will often happen on mixes that are actually otherwise good. Like you can tell the person really cared. They were really trying. They were really trying to get things in a good place. And there's a lot of elements that work, but there's just a few major balance mistakes that happen in their mix. And the more subtle version of this is that they made some of these major balance mistakes because they didn't automate enough. They finally decided on the right level for that vocal or for that hi-hat or for that guitar, and it worked on that one section that they were looping and they got kind of perfect. But now here we are in a different section. This is a different verse with more instrumentation than the prior one, or now we're in a chorus. Those things have to change. So a big reason that these major balance mistakes will happen in a mix is because the mixer isn't automating enough. So there are quick fixes for this that are easy. Number one is the most important part of mixing is prioritizing things in just the balance and pan relationship. And in the Mixing Breakthroughs course, I give you a step-by-step process for mixing that gets this stuff out of the way and gets it happening really good, where you're really just focusing on nothing but balance and pan in the beginning before you mess around with compression and EQ. And then your last stage, again at the end, after you've done everything, is to do your final balance checks, which are usually going to include volume automation throughout the mix. And I don't want to go into a ton of detail there, but just know that that's the biggest thing to listen for. How loud the kick drum is in your mix relative to other records. And you'll find this a lot with mixers, engineers, and producers who are starting to get good chops and that they really want to push their kick drum and make it so that everyone can hear their kick drum. But then you listen to it compared to some of their other favorite records and it's like, whoa, that's actually louder than you need it to go. You're obsessing on that instrument too much, and I can tell. Or it could be a bass that jumps out a little bit too much or is a little anemic compared to other things. So these are some of the major things to check for balance at the end of your mix. Kick drum, relative to records in your style, bass, vocals, snare drum, high percussion. That includes things like hi-hats, shakers, cymbals, tambourines, and then everything else. So one of those either being much too loud or much too quiet, relative to how it should be for your style, definitely a big thing. All right, here's the next deadly sin of mixing that will make mastering engineers have a hard time with what you're doing. And that is overdoing it with stereo wideners in the mix, instead of relying on great panning choices during the mixing stage. I like wide sounding masters. I like wide sounding mixes. And one of the things I can help a lot of my beginner to intermediate clients with at mastering is helping the soundstage open up and make things feel a little bit wider. And I can do that with stereo enhancement tools. There are very selective ways I think you have to do this, where you're expanding some frequencies in stereo wideness and not others, because if you just go and widen everything, it's often a problem, particularly with low end, but on a lot of mixes, you might not want to widen the highs as much as the mids, or it can be the opposite way around. And sometimes I even have to do the reverse and use some of these stereo enhancement tools to make mixes a little bit narrower and more focused in certain areas. But one problem I do experience is I can almost always tell when someone has pushed it with a stereo widener in the mix stage, whether on the instrument level, the instrument subgroup level, or on the mix bus. And it's very, very hard to correct problems from pushing it too wide with stereo wideners in the mix stage and on the mix bus. I'm not telling you not to make your mixes sound wide. Absolutely, please do make your mixes sound wide, because the best sounding wide masters aren't the ones that get the most stereo enhancement in mastering. They're the ones that come from the widest mixes. But the best way to do that well is not by applying stereo enhancers. It is by mixing wide, by making bold panning choices. And it could be as few as 2 or 3 or 4 elements that are panned really hard that make the whole mix sound wide. You don't need everything panned wide to make the mix sound wide. A few key details that are panned wide, 2 of them or 4 of them with everything else centered, can lead you to a really wide sounding mix. And you also want to often pan things that are complementary but slightly contrasting. For instance, two elements that maybe have a similar tone, but slightly different rhythms. Or they kind of have complementary tones, like one is more focused in the mid-range in this area and one's more focused in the mid-range in this area, or one kind of leaves a hole for the other. And I talk about that in much greater detail in a podcast episode about how to make your mixes sound wide. Those are some of the opening principles, but if you want to hear me go on about how to do that forever, I'll try to link to that one here as well, how to make your mixes sound super wide. That's a good episode. I talk about it a lot, of course, in the Mixing Breakthroughs course, and we look at real examples of it. So that's something else to know. The one type of bus processing I'm going to encourage you not to do so much of, or any in the mixing stage, is stereo wideners. If you're going to do it, just do a little bit and know that your mastering engineer can use stereo wideners as well or better than you, and I would focus on making your stuff wide with the pan knob or effects that are panned. All right. That leads us to the next one, which is about effects. And this is another one I've talked about in some great detail in a particular podcast episode that I think is about the two biggest reverb mistakes you can make. So this next one is poor use of effects, notably and specifically not thinking about EQing your reverb or delay returns. This is one big thing that I've heard plague otherwise pretty good mixes that have a lot of good stuff going on in them. They will have a vocal reverb or something like that that just has way brighter or way bassier of a tail than is appropriate for the genre or takes up way too much space in the mix. On your favorite records, almost always the reverb return is going to be EQ'd. It could be the reverb send, the instrument before it gets to the reverb is being EQ'd, but often the reverb return is getting EQ'd. It could be either or both, but most of the time you're not going to have full bandwidth reverb. Often some high frequencies are going to be rolled off of that reverb, so you don't just get a ton of S and T reverb happening. It's not super splashy, it's not super bright, and doesn't draw too much attention to itself. Or you could have a fairly bright reverb with a lot of low frequency taken out of it so that it doesn't get too washy and take up too much space in the mix. Or often some of both will be done to the reverb. You could even end up with a really mid-rangey sounding reverb or delay in a lot of great sounding reverbs. And this could be anywhere from a little to a lot. You could be taking out a bunch of low end and just a tiny bit of top end, or a bunch of top end and just a tiny bit of low end, or it's really a mid-rangey sounding reverb or delay. Those often work great, and you can often use more of them without them being too obtrusive. The other big thing that can happen here that can be a problem is people aren't using the pre-delay at all on their reverb, so they have to keep on jacking up the reverb more and more in level just to hear it. So you get a lot of this ambient wash that's taking up space in the mix, where if they just use a little bit of pre-delay to separate the initial hit from the reverb, they could get away with using so much less reverb and have that reverb still be audible and sound cool. So think about that. Are you EQing your reverb returns, and are you using pre-delay on your reverb? And the same idea of EQing goes particularly for things like delay. So that's something. Overly obtrusive effects, particularly, and the most common one I think is overly bright reverbs, where once mastering makes things a little bit brighter, that problem starts to jump out at you. Because most of the time, 70% of the time, mixes usually get a little brighter and a little clearer after mastering than they were in mixing. Of course, sometimes mixes need to go darker in mastering, but more often than not, especially beginner and intermediate mixes, they'll usually get a little clearer, a little bit more detailed, and all of a sudden, that high frequency, splashy stuff in your reverb is poking out. And that leads me to the next two that are really very closely intertwined. And that is insufficient de-essing on vocals. That's number 5. And number 6, overly bright cymbals relative to the rest of the mix. So number 5, the de-essing on vocals. If your mix is slightly a little bit darker sounding, a little less detailed, a little bit less alive sounding than your favorite commercial releases, that's totally normal. Most mixes are that way before they get mastered, and they usually get livened up and a little bit more detailed in mastering. Now, the problem potentially here is your vocal sounds pretty good to you when you listen to it even against references, like it sounds appropriately bright. But the thing that you're not necessarily realizing is that the whole rest of your mix sounds a little bit dark compared to your favorite commercial releases. So you don't notice that there's this little bit of an ST sibilance problem on the vocal. But as soon as we try to make things a little bit more detailed, a little bit more bright, a little bit more lively, a little bit more jumping out of the speakers, the brightness of the vocal gets accentuated potentially even more. And now the S's and T's that weren't a problem when the mix sounded too dark, now are sticking out like a sore thumb. And now the mastering engineer has to go in and apply some de-essing or dynamic EQ to try to control and compensate and try to target it. So we're just getting rid of the S's and T's on that vocal, but still able to brighten everything else up. Where if you made judicious use of de-essing during the mix, that wouldn't have been a problem. And you would have had a vocal that sat well with the rest of the mix. So that when everything gets brightened up, including the vocal still sounds really great. So this is a potential problem where people are maybe using mix references, but like the only thing they're referencing is the vocal, and they're like, I got it! The vocal sounds like the vocals on my favorite records, but the rest of the mix doesn't. So everything else besides the vocal needs to get brightened up, but the only way to do that in mastering is to brighten everything up, so now the vocal gets too bright. The same exact thing happens with number 6, which needs its own category, which is overly bright cymbals relative to the rest of the mix. The cymbals sound fine to you because the whole mix is a little bit dark, but even before I listen to it, I can see it on the meters coming in. And I see the slope looks like this. It's like this downward curving kind of even slope. But then there's this big spike up at 10K every time the cymbals are hitting. And I'm like, oh, it's one of those. And I'm going to have to try to go in there and de-ess or do a dynamic EQ targeting just those cymbals or just those hi-hats so that when I brighten everything else up, they don't become overbearing. So that's another thing to look for. Have you applied any de-essing to your vocals in your mix? If you haven't, you might run into a problem, especially if your mix is a little darker than the average commercial release out there. And what have you done to your cymbals? Chances are you don't need to boost treble high end on your cymbals in most cases. Often cutting out some extreme low frequencies out of a close hi-hat mic, or maybe in some styles of production, cutting out some lows and mids out of the overheads, so all that's left is the cymbals can work. But you really got to get to know your speakers, your monitoring environment, and you can even double check your mix on something like a frequency analyzer and just look and see if when the vocals and or cymbals hit, if you get these big peaks compared to the entire rest of the mix. Now, the answer here is not only entirely visual. Sometimes there can be big peaks up there on a frequency analyzer and it sounds awesome. So don't just let your eyes be the only guide. But when you see that happen on a frequency analyzer, if you decide to use one, just have it be a cue to listen and say, let's just double check this against references, or let me double check it on a couple different systems just to make sure that that area isn't too crazy. And I will find that it's often somewhere between 8K and 12K where this happens, where a lot of people's monitors might have a weak spot in one of those areas. This is particularly common, both the vocal thing and the cymbals thing, with people who mix on headphones. Because often the high frequencies will be kind of crazy with big peaks and dips in the high frequencies on your headphones. So you might have a big dip in your headphones at 8K. So now you get all 8K happy and you're pushing 8K on everything because you don't hear enough of it until you've really boosted it. Or it could happen the opposite way. It could be at 12K, you have a big dip and you're pushing a ton of 12K or 10K because you just don't hear a ton of it on your system. So you're adding more of it than there should be. So really get to know your monitoring. Now, the last one here, number 7, is closely related to this. It's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. And this is overdoing it with low-end boosts that you can't actually hear in your room. It is very common for a mix to come into mastering and need a little bit of, tightening up in the lows. Of course, there are mixes that come in. We're in mastering. We want to juice up the lows even more. But you'd be surprised if you haven't mastered for the average mixing client that more often than not, the low end needs some tightening in some area. And this is often because low end is, again, one of the hardest things to hear well in compromised listening environments, on compromised headphones, in studios that don't have much in the way of acoustic treatment, on less expensive monitors, and so on. You might not be hearing the extreme lows. And that's okay. But just take this one word of advice here, that you're better off not pushing low end that you can't hear. And you're better off having slightly too little bottom end and the mastering engineer has to boost the low end. That often is a little easier and leads to a slightly better result than having too much bottom end that the mastering engineer has to tuck down. Because again, now we're often looking for things like dynamic EQs and multi-band compressors to control the low end when it's excessive so that we don't have to take a bunch of low frequencies out of the mix. Because if we just have to, dial down the low frequencies, then we're taking lows out of everything and making the whole mix sound a little less powerful and more anemic when we just want to tighten up that kick drum or just tighten up a few notes on that bass. So it would have been better if there was a little bit too little kick or bass, and then we just lift it a little bit in one area. That'll often lead to better results. And another reason it'll often lead to better results is because you're probably not going to have the problem if you use a mix bus compressor where that overly loud kick or bass is like the only thing triggering your bus compressor, unless you use a sidechain input on your bus compressor to filter out the lows. But often the same types of people who are putting too much low end into the record haven't really got into side chaining yet and filtering the lows out of their compressor's detector circuit, which is something we can talk about another day. Either you totally understood what I just said or it totally went over your head. Either of those is fine. I definitely go into more detail on that in another podcast episode. So those are the 7 deadly sins. These seemingly little things that are going to make it more likely that you're not as thrilled as you could be with what happens in mastering, or makes it more likely that a mastering engineer who's in your corner is going to say, hey, if you make this 1 or 2 little tweaks, you're going to be much happier with the final results. I hope this one was useful to you. If you have anything to add to these 7 deadly sins of mixing, please let me know in the comments down below. Love to hear from you. I read everyone and respond when I can, or you can shoot me an email over at podcast@sonicscoop.com. If you listen to me talk for this long, you are totally weird, and I totally like you. And you know who would probably be like the best person to learn more about audio and music production from? Me. Apparently you don't mind hearing me talk. So if you're into it and you want to hear me not just talk, but also give you a whole bunch of great audio examples to improve your chops in mixing or mastering or using compression, check out one of our full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, which you can get over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. It will teach you to mix faster, more creatively, with more confidence and better results than ever before. Try it out for free with a 30-day money-back guarantee at mixingbreakthroughs.com. I give so much more detail on all the ideas we talked about today, what to do about them, with a complete framework for mixing that will take you through step-by-step repeatable process that works every time for getting better sounding mixes faster. Or if you want to get into mastering for yourself or learn more about mastering so you can do it for yourself or others, you can check out the full-length course Mastering Demystified over at masteringendemystified.com. I will teach you everything that I know about mastering. It has, again, a 30-day money-back guarantee. You got nothing to lose, so check it out at masteringendemystified.com. Last but not least, whether you're into producing or mastering or mixing or anything, compressors are a tool that you're going to run into. But they take the longest of any type of audio music production tool to really learn how to master. But I can help you cut that learning curve down dramatically with the full-length course, Compression Breakthroughs. It's practically 10 hours all about compression, compressing every single instrument in every single genre. Individual master classes for every type of instrument. But even more importantly than that, if you just go through the first couple of hours of compression breakthroughs, it's going to change the way you hear, understand, and use compression forever, for the better. Gotta check it out at compressionbreakthroughs.com. Again, 30-day money-back guarantee. You check out the first couple hours of this course, tell me, oh, I didn't learn anything, you get your money back. But the chances of you saying that are so close to zero that guarantee is absolutely there. So check it out at compressionbreakthroughs.com. Big shout out also to some plugin companies giving some free stuff. GPU Audio. Get their free convolution reverb at gpu.audio/sonicscoop. That's gpu.audio/sonicscoop. This is available for a limited time, free early access to their new convolution reverb powered by the severely underused GPU inside of your computer. So get it for free, convolution reverb, great sounding, low latency, gpu.audio/sonicscoop. Also, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning, one of my favorite makers of creative effects in the known universe. Who are they? Sound Toys. Check out anything they make for free for 30 days, or don't, because if you do, you'll just want to buy all the stuff, which you probably should. Just get the Sound Toys 5 bundle already. It's one of the biggest steals in the world of plugins. Check them out at soundtoys.com. Thanks for checking me out. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. See you next time.